Welcome to Tenak Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk, weekly Parsha. This week, being brought to you by Ira Michelson, Parshat Metzora. Good morning. To you it is good morning for the most part. Much more morning than you would like, probably.
Coming to you from the holy city of Tzfat. We used to call it the KATZ Studios.
That's
when I used
awesome.
to record with Rabbi Katz. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, it's been a while since we've had you here, and it's always a delight to have you back. And, and I'll say it every time you're on, you are the inspiration for Tenak Talk in all, about as many manners of speaking as I could think of. And your kindness and generosity for coming down and visiting us here at our little group when you did. Was just that was the first domino, and they're still falling, Baruch Hashem. So
I appreciate the Baruch Hashem. The interesting thing is there's a concept in the Kabbalah that talks about shefa. The word is shefa, and different people describe it in different ways, bounty or flow. And really, what it is about it's about light. It's about light coming down from Hashem, William. And it's about becoming vessels of light. And it's all about chokhmah, about wisdom. There's no point in us receiving anything if we're not going to be willing to give it out. And that's, I just did a show recently with Rav Dror Moshe Kasuto, where we talked about this, the responsibility of the Jewish nation to the nations of the world. If we are really going to be a light to the nations, what Rav Dror said is, God didn't choose us because we're nicer. He didn't choose us because we're taller. He didn't choose us because we're better looking or we have nicer faces or nicer nose. He gave us the Torah. He gave us, and he chose us for this information to be able to be passed out, to be able to pass out to the nations, to be able to be passed out to the world, so that the wisdom of Hashem would reach the ends of the earth. So,
Amen.
This is what we're called to do, all of us.
Hey, before we actually get started, since we're actually on that topic, do you mind if I just ask you a random question, biblical Judaism question?
Sure, I don't know that
it doesn't.
I can answer.
Well, it's okay. I'm just kind of looking for some insight. Before we get kicked off with the Parsha, I don't think it has anything to do with the Parsha, but the Jews are the light to the nations. Why is it that it's so difficult for those when they see the light to actually partake in it? Well, no, let me be more specific. It seems from the perspective from the vantage point of the person wanting to join or wanting to be a part of. It looks so hard for them because it seems like they're being pushed away. So is it, and this may be the wrong way of putting it, but it'll make a good point. Is it like someone dangling a piece of candy in front of somebody or a nice juicy steak that's, when they're over here living off of, dirty ground beef and then all of a sudden saying you can't have any? What's the truth behind everything in your opinion?
So I can only give you a perspective.
That's fine.
I mean, think about this for a second. If we were going to talk about, for instance, the great sages of Judaism, we call the Chazal, the sages of blessed memory in Judaism. We sometimes have to, and we always talk about context when we're talking about anything scriptural, anything biblical. We have to have context. Context is going to be very true within the Sforim, the books that were written by Chazal as well. But we can't get context unless we understand where they were living and how they were living at the time. And most of what we read from Chazal, when we read the Gemara, when we read the Talmud, which is made up of the Gemara and the Mishnah being the laws and the Gemara being the commentary on those laws. We have to realize that those things were written, William, in the midst of great persecution, in the midst of Christian Europe, in the midst of Muslim countries, like where the Rambam lived, one of the great sages. So we have to frame a lot of what they wrote within that context. So we have to take a step back sometimes and wonder whether or not we're still dealing with the same type of fear that was involved back then. Okay. The second part is And some people are not going to like what I say about this, but we have become arrogant. There's a certain level of arrogance that has taken place within the nation of Israel, within the nation of the Jewish people. In being called to be a light to the nations, as I said, the way Rav Dror explained it, it's not about us being better than anybody. It's about us being willing to impart wisdom. Sometimes what ends up happening is what I like to call it is the hamster on the wheel effect. There are people that do things and they're just like hamsters running on a wheel. They get up every day, they daven 3 times a day, they put on tefillin, they daven shacharis, mincha, and maariv, they do everything on time. But what do they do when they go home? They scream at their wives, they scream at their children, what is their life like? And that's what we really have to look at. So I think I'm giving you a combination answer, and I think it's a combination of the two. I think there's a combination of a fear that we don't want to rock the boat. We want to kind of keep things status quo. And then I think there's a certain level of arrogance as well involved. And when you put those two together, it makes it very difficult.
Gotcha.
And
I guess I could say, just from my experiences, I have experienced that. I say numerous, that's not true. About 2 or 3 times where it was really blatant, just pushing me away. Okay. However, I have to be fair as a whole. I only hear about these types of stories maybe once every month or 2 or something of that nature. And so they do happen, but I also hear a lot of really wonderful stories how somebody went to this synagogue and they were accepted with open arms. So, as we speak, we're not saying that everybody fits into one category either way, but it's a reality. It's there.
Right.
So,
well, I think it's important to know also that we all have to be satisfied with who Hashem made us.
Good word.
One of the greatest things, one of the greatest issues that I deal with on a pretty consistent basis, in going out and meeting people, coming out and meeting you and meeting the people in your community and going to different communities, and especially people who have come out from Christianity and have given up idolatry and are now trying to find their place, is this lack of identity. They feel that somehow I don't belong. I knew where I was before, however they describe themselves as Hebrew Christian, Messianic Jewish, evangelical Christian, charismatic Christian. They had an identity. Now they give up Jesus, they give up, belief in Jesus, and they come out, and the Jewish people are saying, oh, nice little Gentiles or nice little Goyim, go away, this is not for you. Or they're told, just be B'nai Noach. Just follow the Sheva Mitzvot, and everything will be fine for you. And what we're seeing is that also Chazal, when they wrote the things that they wrote them in the context of a community like this not existing, meaning that there wasn't this paradigm shift taking place where thousands of people were coming out of Christianity and giving up idolatry and trying to find an identity. With that said, I think what ends up happening is that people need to come to an understanding that that God did not desire for everybody to be Jewish. Now, there are people out there that want to be Jewish, and I tell them there's only one way that anybody should ever consider conversion. And the only way they should ever consider conversion is if they can't imagine living their life another day without being Jewish.
Awesome.
If that's not your answer, then it's okay to be B'nai Noach. It's okay to be a ger. It's okay to be ger. It's okay to be that foreigner that lives and dwells in the midst of the Jewish people, lives and dwells within the midst of Israel, and tries to do everything they can do in order to bring pleasure to the Creator.
That is a beautiful answer, and thank you for addressing that. And sorry for dipping into the Torah Parsha week on that. We probably could have done a whole episode on that topic.
No, these are important. These are very, very important topics. to deal with.
Agreed.
Even sometimes more important than dealing with the Torah portion. And this is where that idea of the hamster on the wheel comes in. It can't be that we get so caught up in stringencies and sticking to things to the point that we lose our connection to Hashem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that God did was he actually rebuked Bnei Israel. He rebuked the children of Israel for worshiping him, but worshiping him without without simcha, without joy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if we're doing things just to do things, but we're not joyous ourselves, and we're not trying to bring joy to the Creator, then we're just hamsters running on a wheel.
Nice. Very nice. Very nice. Okay. All right. Well, Rabbi, I guess moving forward now on Metzora, I'll have to tell you something else.
Thank you for the honor, but you know, I'm not.
Oh my gosh, man! maybe one day.
A lot of people honor me with that title, and it means teacher, but I am not. I let people know straight up front that.
Yeah.
That's smicha. So God willing, one day.
Yes, God willing, one day. Amen. Okay. So Ira, another thing I'll tell you. This particular parsha, I found it was kind of neat that you chose this one because, and this is just another. To me, is just another divine intervention because whenever I was a Christian, this parsha itself was where I first started getting really interested in the fact that there are different types of resolutions for different types of things. Mm-hmm. And as I studied further, and they would go into talking about, for this you have to sacrifice this, or for this you got to do this. And that's when my eyes first started really kind of turning towards Torah and away from Christianity in the New Testament, was seeing that how could all these things that has all these different, even punishments, how could all of them be resolved under one category, the shedding of blood? It didn't make any sense to me. So it really drove me to keep seeking it out further, and I became very much in love with this parsha and all the other parshot that deal with this type of issues. And so again, you have another first with what's going on here. So okay, so I'm going to turn this over to you. I'll follow you along. I'm going to put up the scriptures on the screen. If you want me to put up the Hebrew, just tell me and I'll flash that up too. And if I have any questions or any thoughts, I'll just kind of jump in from time to time. Sound good?
No problem.
Okay. Thank you.
So really, I generally what ends up happening is when I teach on a weekly Torah portion, I very rarely get past the first verse. and really what we do is we start here in the book of Leviticus in Vayikra, the Parsha Metzora, and it starts off in the Hebrew with Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Zot tihye Torat HaMetzora b'yom taharato v'huva el HaKohen. Basically, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, this shall be the law of the Metzora on the day of his purification. So it's, this is one of those Torah portions where most people would look at it and say, really, what are we going to get out of this? We just came out of Tazriah. We talked about the skin disease of Tzara'at, that some people translate as leprosy, and here we're coming into Metzora, and Metzora is the actual person speaking about the individual who has contracted this skin disease that they say is leprosy. But one of the things that we learn in this concept is that this skin disease is not something as much physical as it is spiritual, meaning that it is physical in the sense that the person actually has a skin disease, but it's a physical manifestation of a spiritual lacking. And what we're taught by the sages is that Metzora comes from Motzi Shem Ra, or Motzei Ra, this idea of evil speech or one who speaks derogatorily about other people. So we have to say to ourselves, why is this a clue to the source of tzara'at? And why is it only mentioned after the introduction of the Metzora when we're beginning to deal with his purification? And so we see a couple of things that come up about this. And what it is that really, when you think about it, one's physical state is often indicative of their emotional health. And what do we see as the prescription for a Metzora when somebody has the skin disease? He's put outside of the camp. He's banished from the community. He's basically got torn, if we were talking about today, it would be, the typical person that we would see as being a misfit, somebody that doesn't kind of fit in, somebody that we want to keep away from society. Clearly, not the therapy for an emotional state, but rather the correction of a spiritual decay. This is why that person is put out. Actually, it's very interesting. When I did a teaching on Eov on the book of Job some time back, I made the argument that Eov very much displayed some of those characteristics when you read about him scraping his skin and so forth. And it appeared to me that he either had some form of leprosy or some form of tzara'at, some form of skin disease. If people go back and read the book of Job, they'll see what I'm talking about there. So you brought up an interesting point. So we start to see now certain things that have to happen, like the things that have to be brought by the Metzora. What does he have to do? He has to give 2 birds. Interesting. I say he has to give 2 birds, but if you really read the Hebrew, it says that 2 birds are taken for him. It doesn't even talk about the Metzora necessarily being the one that brings the birds, like buying the birds, where typically, when we see other types of sacrifices, how they would have to be handled. So we see that the Metzora has to bring the 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet wool, and hyssop. And he has to bring them to the Kohen, to the priest. We see that 1 bird is slaughtered over an earthen vessel containing natural spring water, or what we call mayim chaim, living water. And then the live one is then, along with the cedar, the wool, and the hyssop, dipped into this earthen container. It's then sprinkled on the Metzora 7 times, and then the live bird is set free. So the first thing that we have to understand is that this is not a sacrifice, okay? And what I mean by that is it's not a sacrifice in the sense that it's not presented on the altar. We never see either one of these birds presented or the blood placed upon the horns of the altar, the blood poured at the base of the altar. All we see is the blood used from the 1 bird to sprinkle the Metzora, and then the live bird is set free. Now, Rashi writes, when we talk about, and Rashi, one of the great sages of Judaism, when we talk about this idea of Metzora, this idea of evil speech, Rashi writes that in order to atone for his errant speech, birds, which are always chirping incessantly, are the things that are brought. And the Kli Yakar explains, the Kli Yakar also is one of the sages of Judaism, commentator, explains that the 2 birds correspond to the 2 types of speech. Okay? 2 types of speech being that there's good speech and there's bad speech. We actually have Lashon HaKodesh. We talk about Hebrew. We read this verse in Hebrew. It's called the holy language. We know that it's through the Torah that God created the world. We know it's through the very words of Torah that are the blueprint of creation. So we know that there's divine speech, and we know that there's evil speech. Speech can be used to create, speech can be used to destroy. The interesting thing is that sometimes I think people forget the good part. A lot of times, you and I spoke over the last month or so about a whole big balagan that was going on with what we call lashon hara,
right.
This idea of evil speech going on between several different people and several different groups. Well, what people often forget, William, is good speech. And what I mean is abstaining from good speech. You know, sometimes not giving an encouraging word is just as damaging as speaking something negatively.
Right.
There are times when you are in your house, William, and your wife needs to hear something from you. Your children need to hear something from you. And you abstaining from giving them what they need is sometimes just as damaging as if you were to scream and yell at them. And I think we miss that sometimes.
That's a good point.
The Zohar HaKodesh, it cryptically comments that one bird atones for evil speech and one bird atones for good speech, like I said. And that's the tza'at that is spoken of in this week's Parsha is, again, not the physical affliction, which is commonly translated as leprosy, but it's a spiritual affliction. So, as I said, just as speaking gossip can sometimes destroy a marriage, a partnership, a friendship, so the same way, sometimes speaking words of encouragement and friendship can take a person who is depressed and lonely, disheartened, and bring him back to life and instill new life into him. So it's important that when we're out there that sometimes you smile at somebody. You know, I love when I go out into the street. We have the main street that circles the city of Tzfat called the Midrachov, Rachov Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Street. And every time I walk on the street, my wife walks with me and she smiles at people. She always smiles at people. And if we're walking on Shabbat to somebody's house or back from somebody's house, we always make a point to say Shabbat Shalom to people, even if they look like their head is down and they're not going to say it back. It's very, 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 very important that we remember these things, these kind of things. If we analyze the deeper nature of the sin of lashon hara, we discover that there are really two sides of the same coin. Excuse me. If we really want to discover the root of something in the Torah, an approach to use is to look at the first place that occurs in the Torah. So when we examine what happened in the first place, where it's mentioned, we find the key to understanding what this mitzvah or the prohibition is all about. And the first time that we see this idea of evil speech found, where do we find it in the Torah? We find it in Breshit. We find it in the snake or the serpent.
Nice.
Right?
Yep.
Chava, Eve or Chava, refused the serpent's suggestion to eat from the tree of knowledge, explaining that God had forbidden them to eat from it. And the serpent dismissed this as a sinister plot on God's part, right? He says, God knows that when you'll eat from the tree, your eyes will be opened and you'll become godlike. That's what he says. So Rashi elaborates on the argument here. And he says, every professional hates competition. Isn't that interesting?
That's funny.
That basically the snake's argument, the serpent's argument is that God ate from that tree and acquired the knowledge to create the world. So he's jealous and doesn't want you to have that same capability as he has. That's a very interesting concept when you think about it. And Adam had the best situation imaginable. He was sitting in the garden in Gan Eden. He was being fed by the malachim, by the angels. What could be better? What could be better than that? But then the serpent came and argued, nah, it's not so perfect. You don't have the tree of knowledge. You're not like God. See, the serpent looks at the situation that is virtually perfect and finds fault with it. He focuses on the flaw. And this is the essence of Lashon Hara. The essence of Lashon Hara is finding the flaw.
Interesting.
So
it's not even now. One thing I think I heard you mention before and other teachings was that it can also be construed as Lashon Hara if whether what you're saying is true or not. Even if it's true, it's still speaking ill and shining negative light on someone.
Oh, absolutely. In getting into the details of Lashon Hara, which could be an entire series of shows, not just one show.
Right.
The laws of Lashon Hara are very detailed, and there's only one situation. And not only is it one situation, but there are 7 requirements that have to be met in order for you then to be able to speak. And typically, this is only in order to protect somebody from harm. This would be to protect somebody in business from harm. This would be to protect somebody from physical harm, and so forth. But there would have to be 7 requirements that have to be met that you would have to look at and say, yes, I've met this, I've met this, I've met this, I've met all those 7 before then you could speak even something that was true, but only for the sake of protecting somebody.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming that, I'm sorry. So the situation with, for example, Aaron and Miriam towards Moses, that was Lashon Hara, right? I mean, she suffered leprosy or that whole thing, right?
Well, I mean, there are different opinions on that.
Okay.
There are definitely different opinions on that. There are actually opinions in Chazal, in the commentaries, that only a person of very, very high stature would suffer from the disease of tzara'at.
Ah, interesting.
Which is why they had to be brought to the Kohen. So there are differing opinions on that, but that would take us on to a different trail.
Right.
That path, I go that way, and we wouldn't get to everything that we want to talk about today, I think.
Okay, that sounds good. Back on track.
So yeah, no, it's no, everything is all good. We can go down these little paths. That's fine, but I don't want to stray too far because there's some interesting things that I want to get to, and I want to honor your time as well. So
sounds good.
So really, the idea of this evil speech is not so much a crime of the mouth; it's a crime of perception. Okay. Based on what I was talking about, because how do you perceive things? You can look at your neighbor and see a nice guy. You can see his talents. You can see his accomplishments, or you can look at the same person and see only his shortcomings and his flaws. The problem is that the person who gravitates towards evil speech is somebody who has a flawed eye on the world, so to speak. He looks at the world with a flawed eye. He never looks for the good in all situations. And that's what I talked about at the beginning when we talked about serving Hashem in joy. If you're serving Hashem in joy, then you're always looking for the good in every situation. The other classic example of Lashon Hara in the Torah, after we get past Chava, is with the Meraglim, with the spies. They went into Eretz Yisrael. The fruits were huge and delicious. And God preoccupied everyone with burials so that the spies wouldn't even be noticed. And what did the spies see? A land which consumes its inhabitants.
Right.
Right? It's how they looked at it.
They see
and
them
the
as
interesting
grasshoppers,
thing is that he told them how to go. He told them to go up on the hill, go up on the mountain and look down. If you're looking down on somebody from a mountain, they don't look like giants. See, if they would have done, it's all a matter of perception. If they would have done what they were supposed to do, their perception of what the land looked like would have been completely different. So really what ends up happening is that Lashon Hara boils down to what I would call a stinginess of perception. Again, it's not so much a crime of speech, rather it's a crime of how one perceives the world. There's actually Rabbeinu Yonah, who lived in the 13th century from around 1200 to 1263. He cites a parable in a work that he wrote called Sharei Teshuvah on a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, that says, the foolish person points out the evil, but the straight person sees the positive. And the parable that he brings is that two people walked past a carcass, and the carcass was putrid. And one person, that stench is horrible, and the other person said, look how white its teeth are.
That's funny.
So he said the first person is called foolish, and the second person is called straight, because one saw things in the negative and one saw things in the positive.
I saw a cartoon that had the same enlightenment. It was just a caption. No, it was actually a little video clip, and one of the characters said to the other, says, like kind of sad, like, one of these days we're all going to die, and the other one says, yes, but on all the other days we won't.
Yeah. So I mean, really, you could go into detail as to, the earthen vessel and the spring water, and how this Metzora is brought into purity or brought back into the camp. Really, what ends up happening is we have to get to a point where we recognize the destruction and the pain that can be brought on by our words, and that the short time that we have here in this world, as I talked about, should be to bring light. Mm-hmm. It should be used to illuminate the world for others, not to cause hardship or pain, not to put ourselves into a state that we have to be broken in order to achieve purity. The bird is slaughtered into an earthen vessel, a kli, the ultimate end of the forbidden speech. And the vessel is not empty. It contains natural spring water. And what does water usually represent? Water usually represents the Torah, which is the good speech. And the word Torah is mentioned 5 times in regard to the Metzora. So really what we're talking about is involving ourselves, immersing ourselves in the work of the Torah. Because once you do that, your perspective of the world around you changes, and the urge that you have to speak negatively moves further and further away from you.
That makes perfect sense, yeah.
Right. So the bird that remains alive corresponds to the speech of Torah and to tefillah, to the idea of good speech and to prayer. But even that, before it can be let loose, must be joined with the cedar, with the scarlet wool, and with the hyssop. And Rashi explains that one represents the haughtiness, one represents humility, and only when they're bound together, only with humility, when everything is bound together, can one set forth and succeed in Torah and tefillah. Okay. So the atonement for the past and the lessons for the future are all contained in the purification process of the Metzora.
Okay, I have a question for you. We can skip the question altogether if you think it'll be too deep, or if you just want to touch on it. As you're telling me this, I'm thinking about the Yom Kippur, the whole sacrifice there, and is there any connection with the bird that's set free and with the lamb that's set free? And of course, in Talmudic writings, the lamb that is actually set free is taken to Azazel and led. Right? Is there something in that second bird that's set free, the things that's dipped in and stuff, that would make it make it a target for a meal. And I know it sounds kind of out there and bizarre, but I'm thinking if there's a similarity in the way the first one was handled with this one, it could make more sense in other areas as well.
No, and I'll tell you why. It's very interesting that you bring that up because, in really studying every year these Torah portions, I spend a lot of time on them. And typically it's funny because some people find some of these Torah portions to be very tedious to study. And yet I study them because there's always something in them for me. I always feel like there's something I'm missing from year to year. And it really took me back to really going very deeply into studying the whole sacrificial system again, based on what you're talking about, on this idea of the birds and the purification. Not only do they not have a connection to the Yom Kippur sacrifice, but they don't even have a connection to the birds that would be offered as a sacrifice for somebody that couldn't afford. It's just straight up the purification ritual for the person that is Metzora. Now, why is this interesting? Maybe I'm going to jump forward a little bit and see if we can deal with a very interesting thing that comes up. What is it that comes up all the time? And I thought you were going to go there and you didn't. So I'm going to go there for you.
Okay.
When you talked about Christianity and coming from Christianity and different perspectives. The concept of Metzora is brought up in the Talmud. And it's brought up in the Talmud related to one of the what many of us in the counter-missionary community call the nuclear bomb of the Hebrew Christian movement, which is Isaiah 53.
Okay.
Because there is a reference in the Talmud and it's one cryptic passage from the Talmud, and the sages discuss the different theories about the potential name of the Mashiach. And several schools of disciples offer different opinions. And each one has a theory about what the name of the Messiah will be. We see this all throughout. I've talked before about the different style, the argumentation, the rabbinic argumentation that takes place in the Gemara, where we talk about the facets of the Torah and different extremes are brought. So we see differing opinions brought from the different schools of thought. And after the Talmud offers the list of opinions, like it does in many, many cases, it presents an authoritative ruling of the sages. And one of the names that is given for Mashiach in the Talmud is, it says this, it says the Messiah will be called the Metzora, the leper of the house of Rabbi, or the leper scholar. It's a strange name indeed for the promised Mashiach, no?
Right, certainly.
And the rabbis say this as it's related to Isaiah 53 verse 4, which says, surely our sicknesses he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. And that's from Sanhedrin 98b. So you can imagine how that's jumped on. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it might even make you a little uncomfortable, me saying that, no?
For me, it's like, well, for me, that kind of falls in the same, in a similar category as the discussion of the Passover sacrifice, right. Because, if the Christian world, if the New Testament world, that includes Messianics and anybody else who subscribes to the New Testament as God's holy word, if they could just wrap their head around the what the Passover's what the Passover sacrifice actually was in the Hebrew Scriptures, that there's no way in a million years they would ever say that Jesus was the Passover lamb. They would avoid it like the plague,
Right.
And
so I thought after we dealt with the whole issue of the Metzora and Metzora and this, that I would go into this, because I think it's very important that your listeners hear this, and God willing, there's somebody out there that doesn't understand this Isaiah 53, and maybe for the first time they'll hear this in a new way. I think it's very important that we touch on this.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, good point.
So I did a show on my radio show with Rod last week on this concept of what we call nagia, touching. It was this idea of how, we see in the news all the time situations where Orthodox Jewish men are getting on airplanes and they're refusing to sit next to a woman, for instance, and they want their seat changed. And we talked about the halakha, so we're not going to get into that now. But it's interesting that the word nagia, touch, has similar spelling to the Hebrew verb nega, which means to smite or to plague, which is what we see in Isaiah 53. And the Torah refers to the condition of leprosy with the noun form of the same word, which means plague, smiting and affliction. And like I said, the Talmud quotes Isaiah 53:4, where Isaiah uses the same word to describe the affliction of the suffering of the servant, where he says, surely our nagu'ah, our sicknesses, or, it's the noun form of that verb, to smite. He himself bore and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Now, on the basis of these associations, the sages referred to the suffering Messiah as the son of Yosef, Mashiach ben Yosef, as the leper. Okay? So there's two things that we have to talk about here. First of all, the fact that we often hear about Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, and the fact that they are two completely different people. The Messiah, son of Joseph, carries the suffering of the exile and the punishment of the Jewish people like a leper carries his affliction. Mashiach ben Yosef can be in the Midrashic and Aggadic material that we read, where the rabbis compare him to the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. But the first thing that we have to know is that the reason why he's called Mashiach ben Yosef is because he comes from Ephraim. We know that Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Yosef, and Mashiach ben Yosef is called the son of Yosef because he comes from the tribe of Ephraim. Whereas Mashiach ben David comes from Yehuda, from Judah. Okay? So any reference whatsoever to trying to make Jesus fit into this particular verse is automatically destroyed by the fact that we can't have a Mashiach that comes from two completely different tribes.
Right.
He can't be Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. It's impossible. So, the sages of Judaism understood the verse to mean that Messiah took on the nation's leprosy, not literally but figuratively. And the title Leper Messiah sounds like a deprecation, and it contradicts the Bible's own description of the Messiah, because it says that, behold, my servant will prosper, he will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted, which starts in Isaiah 52:13, which starts out the fourth servant song of Isaiah, which talks about the servant. And the scriptures go on to indicate that the Messiah will be the wisest of all men, exalted above Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, even Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, and even the Malachim, that his stature will exceed that of all the great men and kings of the earth. The Hasidic teaching concludes that the Talmud hints some deeper meaning when it refers to the Messiah as the leper. um, it indicates that the Redeemer suffers the agonies and afflictions of Israel's exile. Now, I want to take this even one step further. What do I want to take it one step further? I want to take it one step further because there's a verse, William, in Isaiah 53 that I always bring in argument. And the reason why it really struck out to me this time, or stuck out to me, not struck out. I'm definitely not striking out tonight. But the reason why it stuck out was because the other thing that happens is that after the Metzora is purified, he has to bring an offering. And the offering is an asham. And the asham is the guilt offering that's spoken of earlier in the book of Leviticus, in the sacrificial system. We have the peace offering, we have the chatat, the sin offering, we have the asham, the guilt offering. The asham, the guilt offering, is not a sin sacrifice. It's usually an offering that's brought, what's called for a asham toloi, a situation of doubt, or when restitution is brought. And when restitution is brought for somebody who uses something that's related to the sanctuary in an incorrect way. So let's say they were using something that was related to the temple service, and it was not for them to be able to use. They would have to bring in a sham. They would have to bring a guilt offering. As it relates to a doubt, it would be the situation like sometimes we read in the sacrificial system, it talks about not eating blood and not eating fat. Now, if somebody read that, they would think to themselves, oh, when I have a steak, I'm not allowed to eat the fat. Well, that's not what it says, because there's two different words in the Hebrew for fat. There's cherev and shomen. Only one of them is prohibited, and that is the fat that's placed upon the altar that goes up in smoke to Hashem. The other one is allowed. But why I bring those is because let's say you have a Jewish guy sitting down to a meal, and there's two pieces of fat, and he's sitting down with another guy who's not Jewish, and he doesn't know which piece of fat he ate. There's a doubt in his mind. He's not sinned, so he doesn't have to bring a chatat. In this situation, he has to bring in a sham. He has to bring a guilt offer. So I really thought it was important that people understand that. Isaiah 53:10 is a verse that I bring to people all the time, and I probably covered it when I came to your house, and we did the seminar. And I talked about the idea that Isaiah 53:10 says that the servant must make himself a sham.
Right.
He must either make himself guilty or take on guilt. And as a result of that person, that servant being a sham, he has two things that happen. He has zerah, he has physical offspring, and he has length of days. This is why this situation is so powerful that we're talking about this, and we're talking about the asham. So I thought it was very important to bring that and for people to understand that even if you were to make the argument that this is talking about Mashiach ben Yosef, the suffering servant, that there is no sin sacrifice spoken of there, that it's an asham, and asham is only related to for two types of things: for bringing restitution, for doing something related to the temple that's incorrect. Okay, and nobody who believes in that guy is going to believe that he did something incorrectly as it relates to the temple, even though we know he broke Shabbat and he did many other things that were against Torah. Or it's because there was a doubt, and nobody who believes in him is going to think that there was any doubt in his mind. So these are very important things to discuss.
Okay.
And then finally, go ahead.
No,
I'm sorry.
it's okay. You go right ahead.
No, I was going to say the last segment that I just wanted to talk about, if we have time.
Sure, go ahead.
Is what I call, do you have skin in the game? because it relates to the skin disease. And so throughout the chapters of Vayikra Leviticus in relation to skin and its disorders, it underscores the role of skin, right? And the role of skin can be a medium of communication and a medium of mediation. Remember, I talked about negah, to plague, but it can also come from negah, to touch. For example, it appears in chapter 13 some 40 times, and which is typically translated as plague, derives from the Hebrew root, negah, to touch. So our skin, our first line of human defense and of vulnerability, is also our means of experiencing and reaching out to other people. We get negaim because we're creatures of touch, because we are because our boundaries necessarily abut those of others, because our very skin serves an invitation and a host to others. What's even more interesting about Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language of Hebrew, in talking about things like Nagah, Nagia, and so forth, is that skin as awakening and proclamation. The Hebrew word for skin is ayin vav resh, or, okay, which sounds similar to or light, but it's spelled differently.
Would it be the same as ever also?
Similar.
Okay.
And it comes in a similar root to the verb lihit orer, to wake up or awaken. So we can make similar observations about this, about the Hebrew word or, which means skin, and which appears some 40 times in this chapter in its different senses of human skin or leather. It could also mean li'orer, to arouse. And like I said, it could even be from liha'er, to comment. Presumably in response to something said by someone else. So our skin even speaks. And even more striking is a relationship between the word basar, which is the Hebrew word for flesh, right, another word that we see throughout the chapter 13 of Vayikra, and the Hebrew word levaser, which means to announce or proclaim.
Wow.
So we see over and over and over again, used in the Holy Torah, most often in a neutral sense, but of proclaiming good or bad news. To be mivaser is not just to be one who proclaims, but one who brings the first news of something new, who stands at the very borderline between sadness and joy. So, for example, we read in Isaiah 52, the famous verse, Manavu, how beautiful upon the mountain, the feet of the messenger of good tidings announcing the peace. The harbinger of good tidings announcing salvation, that say unto Zion, Hashem reigns. Here the same root, basar, that is used over and over again in Leviticus to mark a pathological breach in one's skin. Okay, the skin disease is used to suggest a happy turn of fate, a moment not of desolation, but of redemption. And that's really what has to happen. We have to realize that in these days, okay, we're coming up to Shabbat Hagadol, this beautiful time, okay, this beautiful time leading up to the week before Pesach. And there's even a play on words in that. Pesach. The mouth speaks.
Interesting.
Okay? We have to realize how important speech is. We have to see how beautiful the language of Hebrew is. We have to see how important it is for us to come to Hashem, especially in these days, in the days when we're coming, recognizing that we are in exile, but we're getting ready to remember redemption. That exile and redemption are two sides of the same coin. The same side, say we talked about good speech and bad speech. There are always the two sides of the same coin, and exile and redemption are two sides of the same coin. It really comes down, William, to your perception of it.
That's so nice.
Let us really come into these next 2 weeks with great joy, looking at the world in a different way, having a different perception, and serving Hashem with joy all together, not concerning ourselves with whether we're Jewish or whether we're not Jewish, being happy with our identity, being who God made us, and all coming together, trying to do nothing else but bringing pleasure to the creator of the universe.
Amen. Amen. Ira, before we leave, if you don't mind, would you please tell everybody about your talk show with Ira and where they can find you? I've got the ad. I'm putting it up now. And you can just tell them a little bit about your adventure there.
So if people want to listen to the radio show, it's called Beyond the Matrix. You can find it on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. That's all one, no spaces, no dots. IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And if you go under show hosts and click on Beyond the Matrix, it will take you to all of the archived shows, or you can listen live every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. Israel time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you want to contact me, you can send me email at ira@israelnewstalkradio.com. Or if you want to see more of some of the things that I do and some of my teachings, you can go to my website, which is www.torahthreads.com.
Awesome. And just to make it easy for everybody also, I have on my website links to Ira and also to the Israel News Talk Radio there at the top, just like the little menu buttons. And then there's also a link down at the very bottom. If you click on it, it'll take you straight to their website. And of course, Ira's is connected to Torah Threads. So if you can't remember these things, just go to Tenak Talk, look for his name, click on it, it'll take you right there. So, well, Ira, thank you so much for your time. As usual, it's been just a pleasure. And I look forward to the next visit we get. So, shalom, shalom, everyone, and Shavua Tov. Until next time, take care.